to see Madam President as well. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to be seen. How's everyone?
Good, good, good.
Good, how are you?
Good. Hi, Miss Leonard. How are you?
Good, thank you.
All right, everyone. It looks like we got a decent quorum amount of folks. So got the opening remarks and we'll just get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Oops, I'm going camera. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm City Councilor Lydia Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Ops. This is Thursday, December 3rd, 2020, and we're here today for a virtual working session on docket 0945, an ordinance amending Chapter 12-9 of the City of Boston Code ordinances regarding human rights. Councilor Andrea Campbell and Councilor President Kim Janey are sponsors of this proposal, and it was referred to the committee on August 19th. The committee held a hearing on this matter on August 20th, 2020. October 20th, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's modification of the open meeting law, we're having this working session via Zoom. This allows us to do our jobs while also balancing the public health concerns. It will be rebroadcasted. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will also be rebroadcast at a later date on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, Verizon 964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and made part of the record. In quick summary, this ordinance amends the City of Boston Code Chapter 12-9 by adding new sections that would prohibit covered employers from discriminating against employees or applicants based on credit history information and imposes penalties for violations. Docket 0945 contains exemptions for a position or employment classification where credit information is established bona fide occupational requirement. The City of Boston's Human Rights Commission would have the authority to enforce the provisions of this proposal. At the hearing, the committee discussed that the proposed proposal would offer protections against unlawful credit checks by employers in the City of Boston. Councilors discussed that credit history is not reflective of an individual's ability to do the job, and that the use of credit history is often used as a pretext for discrimination. Councilors discussed that the proposal will make employment opportunities more equitable, as credit history can be a barrier to employment. The following individuals from the administration offered testimony at the hearing: Vivian Leonard, Director of Human Resources, City of Boston; Evandro Carvalho, Executive Director, Boston Human Rights Commission, City of Boston; Lynn Sanders, Deputy Director, the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, the City of Boston. Participating in this working session today on behalf of the administration are Vivian Leonard, the Director of Human Resources, and Evandro Carvalho, the Director of Human Resources Commission. Since this is a working session, we will discuss the specific language of the proposal as well as the following issues: any employer concerns, the city policy in general, whether employers that the city contracts with use credit history in employment, impact of the ordinance on city contracting, adding protections for housing purposes, and background on city and state and federal policy. I am going to now introduce my colleagues in order of arrival. I have Councilor Flynn, Councilor Braden, and Councilor Janey. Let's see, have I been joined by any other councilors? I do not see.
Councilor Campbell is on.
Councilor
And
Campbell and Councilor Wu. I see. Thank you.
And Ms. Sanders from the administration is
Yes,
also on.
1 second. And so I'm sorry, Lynn, I'm sorry I didn't have you on the list. Thank you for joining us today. So right now, I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleagues for some very brief opening remarks. Actually, I think, no, I received a letter from the law department that I'm going to read into the record, or summarize into the record, as most of my colleagues should have received this letter as well. It is with regards to this proposal. This is sent by Corporation Counsel, specifically Adam Saterbaum. This letter basically states that with regard to the working session on the City Council's Committee, Government Ops, that you plan to participate in today, letter is actually to Ms. Leonard and Ms. Carvalho and Ms. Ortiz. that the proposed ordinance would prohibit the use of credit information in employment decisions by certain employers. You've expressed that the administration and the Human Rights Commission staff are both supportive of eliminating the use of potentially discriminatory credit information in certain employment decisions, but have asked the law department whether there are legal issues to consider as part of any conversations about the specific language or provisions of the proposed ordinance. We have received the proposed ordinance and believe that the current draft likely exceeds the city's authority under the Home Rule Amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution, and may also be in conflict with current state law concerning the use of consumer reports. In summary, the proposed ordinance would amend the Human Rights Commission ordinance to make use of credit information an unlawful discriminatory practice in a variety of employment-related circumstances. Where it permits the use of credit information in employment decisions, it would require employers to afford people certain notice and opportunities to explain and correct the information. Critically, it would provide authority to the Human Rights Commission to enforce compliance with those rules through the issuance of fines. Under the Home Rule petition or a Home Rule amendment, cities are not authorized to enact private or civil law governing civil relationships except as an incident to an exercise of an independent municipal power. The proposed ordinance would direct and control the private employer-employee relationship under threat of enforcement and fines by the Commission. Such regulation governs private civil relationships, and the law department is not aware of the independent municipal power to which the exercise of this power is incident. With this in mind, it appears that the ordinance, as written, exceeds our authority under the Home Rule Amendment. Additionally, the proposed ordinance may be in conflict with the rules about the use of consumer reports set forth in GLC 93, sections 50 through 67. Under the Home Rule Amendment, the city may not only adopt an ordinance that is not inconsistent with laws enacted by the general court. This limitation preempts local laws that conflict with state laws or seek to regulate where comprehensive state legislation on topic has already occupied the field. Chapter 93 sets forth a relatively comprehensive set of rules concerning the creation and use of credit reports and private rights of action to enforce them. The statute authorizes the provision of consumer reports for use for employment purposes. Because of these legal issues, we do not think that there are drafting changes that you can offer at the working session to prohibit the use of credit checks by private employers. However, you have expressed that the Administration and Human Rights Commission staff are supportive of addressing this important issue. This letter is not meant to suggest that you cannot continue the work with your colleagues on the City Council on these issues. The city can pursue a Home Rule petition for a special law granting the city the authority to prohibit credit checks for employment, propose or advocate for general legislation authorizing Massachusetts cities and towns' authority to prohibit credit checks for employment, and support the pending state legislative efforts to amend Chapter 93 to restrict the use of credit checks for employment purposes. Moreover, you can consider how to prevent the potential discriminatory effects of credit checks. Likewise, the letter goes on to explain, again, this is to Ms. Leonard and Ms. Carvalho, the ways in which they could continue to push for and explore ways in which it could reduce discrimination in the city of Boston. But in short, the letter from the law department is claiming that the current proposed draft of the sponsored ordinance by Councilors Janey and Councilor Campbell is in conflict with the Home Rule petition, and therefore the Constitution of the state is in conflict with in conflict with consumer rights or consumer reporting statutes in the state laws. So I wanted to put that out there. And I guess I wanted to talk directly to the administration, because this is a working session. I have every intention of going through the language of this ordinance and making sure that we're going to get it to the best place possible. Now, the law department has outright said there's no way to get there because of the general context of this. So I don't know if you guys are here to work on an ordinance that the law department just told you is not constitutional, but I really want to know that before there's this big grandiose presentation or conversation. What's the goal for the administration?
So Counselor, I think the goal is to see if we can find a way to bring this bring it into existence so that there is the ability for enforcement. We don't want to be in a position where we find ourselves getting sued by a private employer alleging that we violated the law. So I think, if we can find a way to do this and so that it passes the muster, then I think that's where we want to be at the end of the day. That's the way I think about it.
Okay. Avandro?
One second. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. It's an interesting position to be in as the Boston Human Rights Commission, to be honest. As you know, for those that do not know, obviously, I'm Evandro Carvalho. I am the executive director of the Boston Human Rights Commission. And I want to thank you, Council Edwards and Council Janey and Council Campbell for bringing this conversation forth. And I think, obviously credit history if it's impacting our ability, particularly in our communities that I'm sure all of you represent, from getting jobs, particularly now in this COVID. It's a severe issue that we should be talking about. But Councilor Edwards, for instance, when you say, I guess to some extent, when I took this position, I thought that the Boston Human Rights Commission, at least as the ordinance is written now, right? I really don't represent the administration, if you will, right? The commission is intended to sort of be independent, if you will, right? And to be honest, to help both the mayor and council in terms of human rights in the city of Boston. So I can tell you that from the Boston Human Rights Commission perspective, in fact, since the last hearing, I've had conversations with the chair of the commission, Margaret McKenna, and we both agree that this is an important issue that we should try to be helpful in. So if there's something that can come out of it, I'm happy to sort of figure out what to do, right? In a sense of this particular docket, right? But the letter that you just read, in my perspective, particularly as someone who's an attorney, it's hard to sort of figure out what space is there for the commission to sort of lean on or not lean on, right? And I guess as a general remark as well, we do know, for instance, that the commission, as is the ordinance right now, prohibits discrimination in the space of employment, period, right? Which is the section 3. I think right after this section is where you want to insert this other language. So at minimum, I want to see how the commission can be helpful, because the commission really is trying to be, and it should be, the way I read the ordinance in the space of trying to be what's best for the city of Boston people. Obviously, it's an entity of the city, and so I guess the connotation of administration and not, it's sort of the space that I'm not clear about. But I do think that the commission and its decision, particularly if this was passed and we have to do investigations and such, as an attorney, I take these sort of the space sacred, if you will, because I think it's irrespective to some extent of where we all are, right? So I'm hoping that, I guess in my journal, as I conclude my remarks, is that we get to a place where if the commission can do something, to help the people of Boston in this space. Does that make sense? I'm happy to engage with you in the language and some of my thoughts in the language and so on. But to some extent, I'm not sure, maybe you probably can tell me, know the process way better than I in terms of what happens. I'm not sure how it becomes law and so on. So I guess I've said more than I wanted to say, but I'm in the space of trying to figure out what's best for the commission. But I think the commission really, when I come in this space, particularly in sort of this one, I'm not sure I'm really representing the administration, because really the commissions, they're appointed by the mayor, as you know, and so was I. So we're here to do the work of the mayor, your work, the work of the people of the city of Boston. I'm not sure it's sort of like the same space, right? And I'm happy to answer more questions if I didn't answer it correctly.
Thank you. One second. Well, I just want to be clear that the issue that I'm going to shortly summarize is our legal arguments, I guess, before us So I just wanted to quickly note, actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and have my colleagues do their introductory remarks, and then I'll come back to kind of summarizing what we were going to do today. So Councillor Flynn, then Councillor Braden, Councillor Janey, Councillor Campbell, and then Councillor Wu.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards, for chairing this important working session, to Councillor Campbell and Councillor Janey for sponsoring this as well. I believe that we should do what we can to ensure that job seekers are afforded employment opportunities based on their ability, not on something like credit history. Someone can have a bad credit history because they have outstanding medical bills, various emergency expenses for their family. We had a hearing before on student debt, and we know that having student debt is a common issue that impacts many people's history as well. Things happen, and many people have to take on debt, and they shouldn't be penalized when they are seeking employment. A person's credit history can also be inaccurate. I also filed a hearing order with Councilors Campbell and Edwards on the Human Rights Commission and utilizing it to prevent and investigate discrimination. I'm glad that the Human Rights Commission is playing a part in this ordinance. As we know, it was established under Mayor Flynn. It was deactivated, and then it was reactivated again under Mayor Walsh. And I look forward to discussing how we can best work with the Human Rights Commission. I have great respect for this agency. Thank you for everyone for being here. It's an important discussion. Thank you to the city administration, Vivian Leonard and Evandro Carvello, and the mayor's team, and my colleagues as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the panelists who are here today and my colleagues to discuss this very important issue. It's a working session, so I hope that we will be able to advance some language that is acceptable. I want to echo Councillor Flynn's words that, you know, your credit history can be impacted by all sorts of unforeseen events like medical bills or sudden illness or loss of work. And for that to be an impediment to future employment is basically unfair, and it needs to be remedied. So I hope that we can make progress in this space. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Councillor Janey.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Let me begin by first thanking my sister in service, Councillor Campbell, for her partnership on this ordinance to outlaw discriminatory credit-based practices used by employers. I also want to acknowledge and thank our former colleague and now Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley for her leadership on this work. Looking back at our last discussion, I think it's safe to say that we agree that we need to do something about this issue, that none of us wants to unfairly discriminate against folks with poor credit history. And the question is how. We know that credit checks lock out employment opportunities for individuals to gain potential income and overcome paying back loans to break the cycle of poverty. And more often than not, these individuals come from Black and Latinx communities. This ordinance is very necessary to ensure that we are leveling the playing field, especially as we're still grappling with the financial impact brought on by COVID-19 and the pre-existing inequities, including the growing racial wealth gap here in the city. And I'm very glad, and I want to say off the bat and thank the administration for being here, that the city of Boston does not use credit checks. But that's not enough. We need to make sure that private employers as well are not using credit checks that could hinder opportunities for people in our city. And saying this isn't enough, we've got to codify it into law. We've got to make sure that our values actually follow, that our legislation follows our values. My goal is that we will pass this legislation, this legislative cycle. I think it's important that we get at the issues of hand and have a good, thoughtful, productive conversation here so that we leave this conversation having the clarity needed to put forth something before the council that will be signed, hopefully by our mayor. I want to thank everyone again on this panel, the administration, certainly my colleagues thank my partner on this, Councilor Campbell, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Counselor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you, Madam President, for your partnership on this. And you summed it up. This legislation is critically important, and it has been for some time. And we know that as more residents are facing unemployment because of COVID, this barrier, an unnecessary one, will only get in the way. And if anything, we need to be easing barriers or lifting barriers to opportunity in this moment in time. I too want to thank the administration. Vivian, thank you for your leadership, continued leadership and work. Evandro, thank you as well, and also for your remarks related to the Human Rights Commission and your goal of maintaining its independence, which is critically important, of course. And thank you to Lynn as well for being here and continuing the conversation. I will say that, at least I want to go on the record that when I first introduced this in partnership with now Congresswoman Presley, we got initial pushback from the administration with respect to the legality. And actually in this second round, made some changes so that it would align with federal guidelines as well as EEOC guidelines to get over those hurdles and those legal restrictions. I firmly believe, and this is me putting my lawyer hat on, that this legislation is sound and as is, and that we are not violating any laws whatsoever. I also want to thank Christine from Central Staff, who in the last maybe 2 hours, because we got the letter quite late, turned around really quickly, some legal research and analysis as well for all of us on this. She has been in the weeds for this piece of legislation since the very beginning, even when Congresswoman Presley was still here. And I think, you know, I won't necessarily have any questions. I think for me, it is, you know, some pushback on the analysis that's in the letter that Councilor Edwards read. And, you know, this for me is not unsimilar to the living wage ordinance. If anything, this is exactly that. And just, of course, creating another category of discrimination and adding that to the current work of the Human Rights Commission to say, we want to add credit checks. And on the state law piece, we know there's state law pending and we know how long the state can take to pass legislation. If anything, this gets us ahead of the state and says it's critically important that this not be a barrier. And if anything, the city of Boston would be leading in that regard. And there's no legal restriction to us doing that. If anything, it models what's currently at the federal level, but codifies it locally so that we have the structure and the enforcement power to really take to task those employers who are practicing this and using credit information in promotional or hiring practices. And I think this is an opportunity for the city to lead in this regard. We are already doing it as an employer, which Vivian, of course, spoke to in our last hearing, which was wonderful. This is a continuation of that to say other employers in the city should also follow our lead in practice with respect to this. So I don't have anything else after this. I know you said opening, Councilor Edwards. I don't have anything else. I just wanted to go on the record to say, I think the ordinance as is sound. And I really wanted to thank you and of course, Councilor Janey's office for the quick turnaround and Christine from Central Staff for really digging in at in the last hour or so on this too, given how busy you are. So thank you so much. And again, thank you to all of you for the administration.
Thank you. And Councilor Wu. May have had to, oh, I'm sorry, Councilor Wu. I think I just got a text from her. My apologies. She did say she had to step away. She will, when she comes back, I will have her plug in if need be. Okay, so just to give some, again, and I appreciate Councilor Campbell as one of the lead sponsors having to kind of explain the context and what we're working with here today. I'm going to say very directly what I intend to put before the body, and that is a robust ordinance that bans credit discrimination in employment in the city of Boston. That is what is proposed to this body, and we will be working on that in this working session. I want to directly respond to Attorney Saderbaum's or the Corporation Counsel, I should say, speaks on behalf of the Corporation Counsel. In as much as this is his argument about it flying in the face of the home rule petition and therefore Article 89 of the Massachusetts Constitution. That particular argument is based off of his understanding that we cannot govern as a municipality private relationships or civil relationships between employers and employees. The first argument we would have is that we don't believe that this is part of that definition, that banning discrimination is different than, say, trying to raise the minimum wage, is different than saying certain vacation policies. It's different from that. That's number one. Number two, this was created, this HRC ordinance was created, as my understanding, in the 80s through city ordinance. This was not created as a home rule petition, as in we didn't ask the state to begin with for this particular ordinance. So therefore, our ability to amend ordinances that we created seems to be sacrosanct and within our purview and our ability and our powers as a municipality. As in the city of Boston created this in the 1980s, how on earth the city of Boston cannot amend its own legislation? It was not created by home rule petition. Not only that, but we have amended this before to include gender identity, to include other protected classes. And in no way, shape, or form are we challenged by adding additional classes under the constitutionality. And let me be very clear, the argument that we cannot govern private relationships is not a challenge to the specific addition of credit discrimination. It's a challenge to the whole damn thing. We either can or cannot ban discrimination in employment in the city of Boston. And if that is considered a private relationship that we have no business getting involved in without a home rule petition, then the entire section 12-9 must go. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot use the argument that it's too involved in private relationships when it comes to credit, but everything else that we have banned and discrimination somehow is within that. I don't believe Corporation Counsel is trying to challenge or get rid of the entire human rights commission or law. And if it is, then that flies in the face of the administration, who not only brought this entire law to life, funded it, and hired a director to enforce it. So not only that, we have done this before and we do it regularly. I would say with the Boston residency job policy, the ordinance that we created to specifically govern, even more so than the discrimination practices of employers, but how they hire, how many hours they give to people based on race, based on gender, and based on residency. And you know what we did? This administration amended that recently in 2017 to increase the percentages, further involving itself in the private conversations of employers and contractors even. And it applies beyond just the money where the city goes. It applies to large projects over a certain square footage. We have no problem involving ourselves in that. I'm happy about that. I'm happy that they amended it. And yet somehow we're dealing with this, an additional protected class, and the administration says this is too much. That does not make sense. It's not consistent with its own action, with prior administration's actions. And it doesn't at all make sense considering it's a city ordinance that we created. As far as lawsuits and people challenging the validity of this particular component, they wouldn't be challenging just this. They would be challenging, again, the entire law's ability to involve itself in employee and employer relationships and banning discrimination. I welcome that challenge. I would hope the administration would have the ovaries to also welcome that challenge and defend it. The fact of the matter is, we've been sued before. We've been sued by Airbnb, and we still stood up for justice and moved our ordinances forward. So let the lawsuits come. I would hope that this administration finds that the barriers to employment that are pretextual and discriminatory are worth destroying. And with whatever powers we have, we will move in that position. I want to talk about the consistency with the state laws. Our jurisdiction under this law is exactly consistent with the state jurisdiction under its own discriminatory laws. As in, it applies to employers with 6 employees or more. We have not gone beyond that jurisdiction. We haven't gone further than the state's willing to go. It's consistent with state law. we are consistent in our ability. And if it's a risk that we're taking, it's worth taking to defend people, to protect people, to fight against racial discrimination. I'm proud of my colleagues, Councillor Janey and Councillor Campbell, for standing into the wind and leaning into whatever difficult conversation that we're going to have. I believe all of my colleagues will lean into that. So, with that context and that legal analysis, we're going to push forward and draft this wonderful, historic protection to City Council. I believe my colleagues will pass it, and then it will be up to the mayor of Boston to decide if he's going to lean in or veto it. So, I don't know if people have a copy of the ordinance in front of them, but this is a working session, and you know I work. So if everyone wants to pull that up, I think Christine sent it out again to everybody. There were several components that I mentioned in the introductory remarks about things that were left unsaid or things that we wanted to provide space for. The first was any pushback that we were going to hear from employers. Beyond the, I guess, challenging the whole concept of having a discrimination law at the municipal level, what other pushback did we hear? Has anyone heard, or concerned specifically? I had hoped that the exception provided for bona fide qualifications, right, for financial and certain jobs that require you to have a good credit, I guess, was enough. But did anyone hear? Has anyone received any concerns about whether the actual employer community is concerned about this language? I'm opening it up. Nothing? Not even the sponsors? Did Christine or anybody from central staff, did we receive any arguments that you know of?
I didn't receive any testimony against it from employers. And it didn't go to the committee email either.
Okay, I didn't on my personal either. But I think it would be because it's partly pretty consistent with what the city of Boston has done right now. Okay. Then there was the other conversation about specifically housing and whether this the ban on credit checks could also be expanded to housing ordinances or our fair housing protections. Does the city, beyond the whole constitutional fight, and not even fight, the disagreement about the legal components, but does the city have any thoughts about that? And I do know that one thing that the city, we had hoped to get committed from the city was the outright banning of the practice of using credit checks in the city's lottery system. Councillor Bach brought that up. We know the city already is leading in that you do not use credit checks except for bona fide employment right now. So thank you for that. Thank you actually for setting a model, Ms. Leonard. That's what we do. But we were talking about housing specifically. I see Tim has joined us. Right on time, Tim, to talk about housing?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Tim Davis. I'm Deputy Director for Policy Development and Research at the Department of Neighborhood Development. It was, given that this bill originates around employment, it was only at the last working session that we became aware that there might be an interest in also adding housing to this. We are very interested in moving forward and looking at credit and other tenant selection policies and how we can do more. We already have a Boston Fair Chance tenant selection policy, which applies to the lotteries that are held through the city, both on D&D funded properties as well as inclusionary development units. And that is a start. We recognize that there is more that we can do. And we are interested in looking at what we can do both for income restricted properties and for properties at large and market rate properties, but feel that that is something that needs to have some time and some thought put into it. Both Seattle and Minneapolis have made moves in this respect over the last year. And in each case, they took about 6 months to kind of look at the issue, bring the different parties together. It is different in housing than it is in employment. In housing, a landlord is extending you credit by allowing you to be in the property. And so it's a little different from employment where they're not extending you credit, they're just giving you a job. So I think that we do want to take the time to look at this thoughtfully. Because Minneapolis and Seattle have already done some legwork, we might be able to do it a little faster pace. But I think that I think we should do it as a standalone effort from the employment effort.
Okay, so in terms of policies then, and I'm fine with that. If that was, you are correct. It wasn't, and for anyone watching, that was never filed.
Right.
Was the housing component. The co-sponsors, Councilor Janey, Councilor Campbell, filed in a strictly employment perspective based off of barriers to employment for people, and it came up kind of organically in the conversation. Housing did.
Yeah.
And in terms of the practice, or do you think you'll need much time in terms of the lottery process analysis? I
think we want to see what the best practices are. I know that New York has moved recently to do to look at credit records differently in affordable properties. So those are our examples. Is that Seattle and Minneapolis have looked at all units, so in all situations, and New York has looked specifically at that. And I think we just need some time to really kind of look at that and see where we go with it.
Very well. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then that's fair. We also, let me just pull up the minutes. And you know what, I apologize, colleagues. I got right into it. I didn't go back in line for anything. I went straight into it. My apologies, especially to the co-sponsors. So Counselor, I'm gonna go back in line and have you guys ask whatever questions or concerns. So Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, to Councilor Campbell and to Janey as well. I don't have any specific questions, just a general comment that might be helpful during this debate is during this recession and people being laid off and evicted from their homes or apartments, we're going to see many families going into bankruptcy, probably in the thousands. It seems like that will be the case, and there'll probably be more work for the Human Rights Commission to work on these types of issues or at least address these issues. Just wanted to throw that out there if anyone had a comment on that, knowing that we're in a pandemic, that we're in a recession, and we're in for a difficult economic period. What impact will that have on maybe on the Human Rights Commission?
Andrew, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. So perhaps I can add some value to that comment, Councilor, and thank you for bringing that up. One of the things that perhaps this is actually a different conversation about the Human Rights Commission as a whole, but I can tell you that the commission, there's 7 commissioners, and I'm happy to, I probably will forget some names, so I won't try to recite all the names. They're all people from the city of Boston, right, with various expertise, a few lawyers, in fact, activists and so on that are on the board. One of the things that the board has struggled with since we started, as you know, we actually didn't start meeting until COVID started, really, because the commissioners were appointed early January, and by the time we could launch a meeting, things had gotten much, things were shut down. So a lot of the commissioners haven't even met each other in person. But one of the consensus that the commissioners have arrived at now is that more or less we're not going to focus into, again, this is not set in stone, but that particularly early on, we're not focusing on what we call it individual claims and complaints, particularly because we know that we have, particularly at the state level, MCAD that does the bulk of the, of the state. And in fact, most of the cases that they get, as you probably can imagine, are from Boston, right? That there's a space, there's this, and the EOC obviously does it for the feds as well. So that we're not necessarily looking at individual complaints to resolve each and every one of the complaints, particularly cases that can just go to MCAD to be handled, right? So something like this, right, which I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think that credit history is not, as Councilor Edwards have put it several times, it's not a protected class at the state level right now, right? So that those complaints will be, if this was passed, those complaints we would handle because we would have nowhere to send it to, if you will, right? Because it'll be a local ordinance and it doesn't exist at the state or the federal level. So that's one thing that we are cognizant of right now is that. So again, I guess that's a different conversation. But the commission as a whole right now, we're not at least in the immediate future, we're not handling individual complaints as in thorough investigation of complaints and try to resolve them. What we've done for the little that we got is sort of, guide them to the MCAD and so on and try to resolve them without sort of this formal process that is articulated in the commission's docket ordinance. Now, the flip side is that the commission is looking at systematic issues. For instance, one of the things that we've been looking at now is that I'm sure is no secret to any of us here is the digital divide that COVID has shown to be a rampant issue in our communities because we are relying on these devices now, and whether it's broadband or the lack of training or the lack of actual device, right? Whether it's students or individuals that are aging adults in the city of Boston or immigrants or other, more vulnerable populations, they're not getting access. So we're looking at that as one of the issues. There's several other things that we're looking, again, just particularly as we're thinking about the city as a whole, as we're coming out of this pandemic, as we think about, the mayor made the announcement of the new, created a new cabinet position of the equity and inclusion, which, as you probably are aware, this department is part of that. So where, I guess, long story short, Councilor, I'm happy to engage more in that. But if this was somehow, if this passed, we would be handling those complaints because, again, we can't just send it to state or feds. But at this point, most of we're not handling individual complaints of discrimination. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Evandro, for that answer. Appreciate it. And no further questions, Councilor Edwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to my colleagues, as you're going through, feel free to also indicate if this is something you're going to support. Ultimately, feel free. Don't feel pressured, but feel free. Because I intend to get this before the body in the next 2 weeks, so I would love to hear it.
I thought everybody was already supportive of it. Actually, I'm kidding, Councilor.
Well, I am. So I hope my colleagues will continue to be supportive, and we're just trying to draft something even better. Sorry, Councilor Braden, you're next.
I don't really have a huge questions. I'm learning a lot just listening to you folks, you lawyers. When I think about someone graduating from college with a huge burden of student debt, and then you think about someone who has a poor credit score because of a medical emergency or unforeseen incident in their lives that caused them to damage their credit history. I just think that there's sort of it's not an even playing field when you compare the impacts of one's credit. It seems like there's even biases within how potential employers would look at someone's credit history. If they were looking at credit history, they'd say, "Oh, sure, he's got debt because he's just graduated from college," or they might view some other if someone has a poor credit history because of some other cause, they might have a different view of that, and I think that's always a little concerning. And I don't know, is that a realistic concern, or is that just something that's an imaginary anxiety of mine? Do we foresee that different types of debt are treated differently in this, not going forward, but in the present moment?
I guess I could go to the lead sponsors, Councilor Janey or Campbell.
So I would say we're looking at the overall credit history. And so a credit score is what usually an employer or a landlord or someone would look at, kind of the FICO score and the credit history. And so whatever that debt, whatever caused the debt, whether it was medical bills, whether it was student loans, what have you, I don't think we're making those distinctions here. We're saying that you should not use a credit history as a determination for employment. You should look at the skills, you should look at the resume, you should look at the experience of the individual, but we should not use discriminatory. We know that this is discriminatory and that it unfairly, disproportionately impacts poor people of color in particular, but poor people widely, but poor people of color in particular. And so that would be my 2 cents. Certainly would offer, and I'm not an attorney, so certainly want to hear from the lead sponsor on this and my partner on this, Councilor Campbell, through the chair, obviously.
I would just add that there were some, maybe in some accounts or stories, particularly for some folks who've been working in this for a while, that, if you look at student loan debt or medical bills, or, if your debt is because of credit, running up credit reports, that there might be some bias in how you look at that. We didn't necessarily, I didn't see any reports or anything like that, but you sort of heard it in different stories, how we categorize it. So people tend to, they see medical debt, say, okay, that's out of your control. Whereas some other forms of debt may not be, and you just made poor choices. So I think there's something there, and we heard that maybe in a few stories. GBLS and some others might have some more there because of their work at the state level to try to get something passed, but didn't necessarily see anything in surveys or reports or anything like that.
Yeah, I think my point is, let's hope we can put all of that in the rearview mirror and then level of playing the field and make it that your credit score is not an impediment to being gainfully employed and getting a job and moving your life forward. It shouldn't be a ball and chain that you carry around that stops you making progress in your life.
Right.
So to Councillor Edwards' question, I support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Janey.
Thank you so much. And I will try to be very brief. As my partner and co-sponsor on this has already said, I think the ordinance is sound as is. I think it stands up to the legal challenges. As the only non-lawyer here, well, not the only one, but I really would like to understand if the letter from Corporation Counsel, are these the only concerns from the administration, or are we still, there was concerns around fees before, is that no longer a concern? This concern about collecting fees, that's not an issue? Sounds like it's not an issue. I'm going to take the silence, and it was not mentioned in this letter, so I'm going to take that that's not an issue because.
Council, let me add something briefly, okay? And this is just reading again the ordinance I have in front of me. One thing, and I've read it several times. One thing that I noticed about the ordinance, and this is, I guess, not reference to the ordinance, the proposed docket, okay? I'm talking about the original Human Rights Ordinance Commission ordinance. That ordinance does not have fees in them. That's one thing I noted. It doesn't say in anywhere that fees can be essentially leverage, against employers or anyone really.
So regardless of whether the original ordinance says we can collect fees, the point here is the city of Boston can collect fees, does collect fees for lots of things.
Right, that's true.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to assume that the only concerns that the administration had are in this letter, yes? And it was about, all the things that our chair summarized in her opening, yes? Those are the only concerns? Ms. Leonard?
Yes, I think, we certainly, I wouldn't be enforcing this within the city of Boston in terms of not allowing credit checks if I didn't believe in it. I think the issue becomes, as you stated, what's in the letter. Most certainly, we are for supporting that prevents barriers to employment. So, we've done a lot of work on this. It's been a long process to get to where we currently are. Has not been easy, and it continues to be a work in progress because we're about continuous improvement. So for me, it becomes whether or not there is anything that legally prevents us from enforcing this.
Right, and this would be enforced by the commission. So
Right.
that is my next set of questions is around implementation. So I would be interested, Mr. Carvalho, in what resources do you think the commission would need or your office would need? Is there going to be a database to track compliance and non-compliance? What conversations have been had thus far on your end about how to implement such a change once we pass this on the council and hopefully get it signed by our mayor?
Some of the conversations, again, that I've had, particularly with the chair of the commission and reading, to be honest, reading the ordinance proposed, it really is, and again, actually this came up last time about potentially having a database, but really what I see
So there would be a
here,
database, yes?
I wouldn't say that, right? I wouldn't say that
How
in the
would you
sense.
envision tracking compliance?
The way I see here, right, the way and actually some of this might be my lawyer hat in it, but what I see is, an ordinance that says you cannot do this, right? You cannot use credit, if you will, to determine people's eligibility for work, advancement and such, right? And then if that happens in a particular space, the individual, there's some, obviously some.
How will you track it is my question. My
What do you mean?
question. The
How will I
cases
track
that come before you, how will you
Oh,
track who
okay,
is
sorry.
compliant, who is non-compliant? What will be your process or your systems that you will create to track this? And then the follow-up question is, what support might you need that you don't currently have to make sure that you will be effective in order to carry out the duties? So I want to make sure, we don't want to set anyone up for failure. So if we're doing this, we want to make sure that the commission will have the resources and supports necessary to implement it and enforce.
In terms of I guess manpower, if you will, the ability to enforce
Woman power, is that what you mean?
women power. Thank you,
Thank you.
Councilor Jane.
Thank you.
We right now we have a list of people that we plan to hire, hopefully over the next fiscal year. One of them is an investigator, and if we need more, we can hire more investigators. But as I was saying earlier,
How many investigators do you have? I'm sorry.
currently on staff, none. I don't have any.
So there is a plan in place to hire an investigator now, whether this amendment, this ordinance gets passed, there's already a plan to hire one investigator, yes?
Correct. But to be completely honest with you, when that would happen, I'm not 100% sure. And that's particularly because what I was saying earlier, that the way that the commission is thinking about its mission currently, and that is commissioners, the folks that are appointed, that they're not focusing on individual complaints. So there is, particularly now, there's no immediate need to sort of say, let me go hire 2 or 3 investigators because I don't have an influx of complaints that I'm investigating. Does that make sense?
No, I hear what you're saying, yes. Let me
But
ask a clarifying question on
Sure.
the investigator. So
Sure.
there is a plan to hire one. Is it budgeted in the FY21 budget?
Yes.
Which means you would need to hire someone by June 30th, yes?
Yes. But I also have, I mean, the issue is that, under COVID and the timeline and being able to actually execute it, right? In this sort of next several months, if you will, right? Now, it does, again, if this became law and we went out to execute it, the priorities of who I hired, when we hired people changes, right? What I was saying is that particularly now that most of us, as you know, are working from home, and not in a space where the commission, again, is doing individual complaints, there was no need or pressure on me to sort of say, let me hire investigators to do A, B, C, D, and D, right?
That might be the case now, but if we pass this, that could readily change.
Yeah, that could
I want to keep just a few more questions, if I may.
That could change, yes, that could change.
So I'm looking at the penalty section of the ordinance that is before this committee right here. So not what was passed in the 80s, but right here. And that first section under the penalties.
Let me see.
Page 3. It's only a 3-page ordinance.
Yes.
So it's right at the top of page 3.
Yes.
And it right here, as it spells out, the Boston Human Rights Commission retains the right to issue a complaint and follow investigative procedures. So again, I just
I'm sorry.
want to understand, would you intend on issuing complaints?
So let me just, I'm sorry, let me just make sure I'm on the same, I'm looking at the same thing that you're reading, okay? So I can give you the correct answer. So I see the penalty sections, which is 12-9.38.
If you see my screen, there it is.
Hold on, sorry, I wasn't looking at you. Let me go back to look at this.
Underlined.
1 second. I'm going back from the Zoom to the, let me see, okay. If a person, right.
See that section?
Yes.
Yep, that section right there.
But the first portion of that, though, right? It says if a person believes that means that as the executioner, if you will, if I'm executing this, that means that the person then has come to the office, right, to say that I try to get a job at ABC company and this happened this way, right? So yes, then that triggers me, if you will, which is what I was talking about earlier about the database, because it's all.
So what happens next? Talk to me about that. Yep. So a person has come and said they've been discriminated against. Now what happens next?
So the first, I mean, there's different things we can do, but a place like this, particularly the commission, we're designed more or less to try to resolve situations. Okay, so the person comes in, and again, another person that we could potentially hire and that we haven't hired would be a constituent service person or an intake person that sits with this person and listens to the whole story. Okay, that listens to exactly what happened and type up this sort of intake, if you will, about what happened. Now, the next step would be hopefully to have the investigator now look into it. Now, have the person come in and have a conversation with them, look to see if, we can resolve the matter. What happened, right? Maybe request documents. Maybe if we need to, excuse me, someone pinged me, I apologize. Sorry, I got distracted. It's this new world of multitasking. I apologize. So as I was saying, essentially the person comes in, then the investigator get involved, and hopefully if there's documents that need to be requested, depending on the situation, we request the documents. We may do what's called interrogatories and ask questions of the individual or the other party that they're accusing, right? And then hopefully bring the two of them together if they want to, right? To say, come together and try to resolve this. This is a process that's described.
I don't anticipate that that's going to happen in these scenarios. If an employer is discriminating against a potential employee and using credit check or anything else, there's not going to be some happy mediation moment where you bring the two parties together and they're suddenly hired. Like, it's not going to happen.
No,
if anything, the resolution would be a civil lawsuit and some sort of restitution that way, but it isn't going to resolve itself and that this person is suddenly hired by that company who was doing this bad deed.
Let me ask you this, not to ask, you're the one asking questions, but in a situation like this, right? Ideally, I mean, obviously we can get to a place where a fine can be leveraged against the perpetrator. But ideally, the reason why it's built in the system, and I'm just talking about, again, the process, which you asked about, the process asks this so people can meet. And honestly, if I was a person that was in this position, it'd be great if I get the job versus the city fining the person $100, right? Or whatever the fine may be. So there's a space that's sort of mediation, conciliation, where hopefully we can work things out. Now, if we can't work things out, we determine that there is a probable cause, right? From probable cause, sorry, that's a legal term, but really, did this more likely than not happen, right? Then we file a complaint technically with the commission, like the AD, like the staff of the commission, which is me, if you will. Then I file a complaint with a formal complaint with the commission of the.
Mr. Cavallo, how many staff do you have?
Right now, I only have one staff, ma'am.
Okay. So I'm asking these questions because, again, we don't want to set anyone up for failure. If the commission is going to be charged with ensuring that these rights are protected, and should they be violated, the commission will then issue fines or some sort of levy, then I wanted to make sure that you have the capacity to do just that. That's why I'm asking questions about how many investigators, when will you hire the investigator, who's on your team? Because someone will have to manage who is out of compliance and who needs to be levied a fine. I'm going to, Madam Chair, I know that time is getting short. We don't want to take all day, and I want to make space for other colleagues. Obviously, I am very supportive of this ordinance as it is written and plan on voting in the affirmative for it. I believe, as was already stated, that it is sound and does not violate any of the state laws that we have to concern ourselves with, that it's legally sound. And I don't want to take much time here. I want to make sure that there's space for other colleagues. And I do not have a second round of questions, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Counselor Campbell, do you have a couple minutes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I have no more questions right now, and just thank my co-sponsor, Counselor Janey, and thank you as well. And thank Evandro, Vivian, and Lynn, and Tim also for the housing context and the housing piece, which will continue. So just thank all of you for today's hearing. Thank you.
I just want to note, in terms of also context, the city of Boston, and in terms of enforcement as well with discrimination and tax, recently entered into an agreement with Suffolk, as we remember when we were discussing the testing. And we're going to have our own program for blind testing and blind buying within the city of Boston. And Will Onuoha from the Fair Housing Commission, my apologies.
Yes.
The Fair Housing Commission specifically talked about the complaint-driven nature of that process, and that people would be able to, because of their program, they'd be able to find those discriminating real estate agents, those landlords, and they had no problem accepting those complaints and also assigning fines to them as well. So there is a precedent for it, or at least about to be, with the discrimination in housing component. I recall, if Tim is still here, he may be gone, but he was on the, I think he was on that call. I think all of us actually may have been on that, at least the counselors who are still here. So we have a precedent for that. And again, the issue, as I understand the letter, is specifically as to whether we can expand the discriminatory categories in this ordinance. And if we do that, if it violates the home rule petition. And again, this was not a home rule petition that created this ordinance. We do have precedent for that, obviously, as you know. It wasn't one. We created the ordinance, and so what we're doing is amending an ordinance that we have within our house that is consistent with the powers that the state has given us, which is to regulate and push and prevent discrimination within the city of Boston. Other cities do this as well. The other argument about consumer affairs and whether it flies in the face of those protections in the State House, I recall the National Consumer Law Center, I believe, was going to send some documents, and I'll be following up with them, because they felt that this law had too many exceptions, Councilor Janey, and that they were scared that people would actually be able to get loopholes. So they actually didn't want as many exceptions as we have provided for employers, the National Consumer Law Center. And the other person that we could follow up with for this specific language Counselor Janey and Counselor Campbell, is Nadine Cohen. And she couldn't make today's working session, but she has a copy of the letter and she does not at all agree with it at all. So I believe between following up with Ms. Cohen and getting whatever comments from the National Consumer Law Center, making sure that we tighten up any loopholes, because we're not trying to build something that you could drive a truck through either, and pat ourselves on the back. So I believe we can get there and balance those needs, but I do not see how this flies in the face of the home rule petition law, and the letter from Corporation Counsel really doesn't explain that very well, besides just saying that it does. And if they're insistent on staying in that position, then I think it challenges the very concept of the entire Human Rights Commission. We've now been joined by Counselor Bach. Actually, she just raised her hand, so I'm going to go ahead and let her come in and do any introductory remarks. And I see a Susan Helmy.
Susan is the staff of the commission.
Oh,
Yes.
hi, Susan. I assume she's here taking notes.
Yes,
Unless-
she's
awesome.
she's here to
I
help.
apologize, Susan. My apologies. Counselor Bach.
Yeah, hi, Madam Chair. I was raising my hand just to get in, but I wondered if I could just find out, having just arrived, whether, because I did receive the communication from the law department, whether anyone from the law department is on the line today? No.
We have Avandro, who's the director of the commission, and we have the director of human resources.
Great. And have you already covered the question of sort of, there's a assertion in the letter from the law department that employment is a type of civil relationship that we can't get involved in here, but it seems like pretty much everything else that people would use credit checks for also is some kind of a civil relationship, whether one of commerce or housing or other things. So I wondered if anyone had asked that question yet.
We did not. We took a different context and essentially arguing that if they're challenging the employer relationship as something that we couldn't get involved in, then the very basis of the Human Rights Commission, the jurisdiction, is for employers with 6 or more employees. And so it's not going to be just on whether you can add an additional category, right? It's got to be whether this law can exist. You either can get in or you can't.
Right. Yes, I would be inclined to agree with that as well. Okay, well, I'm sorry to have come late and to have unintentionally sort of butted in here. I just I wanted to see if anyone from the law department was on the line, but it sounds like we'll have to submit some questions to them for follow-up.
Right, and I made my intentions very clear, Councilor Bach. I intended, having discussed the outstanding issues, we asked specifically about whether there are any employers who expressed opposition. We had asked specifically about housing that you brought up, Councilor Bach, and Tim Davis was here to discuss that they're not prepared to, they're not in opposition to having it be in one day a future legislation, but they came into the employment component of this, and so they would like to stay in that vein, though, and they will be examining best practices, looking at Seattle and New York on the lottery system, which you also brought up in the hearing, actually, to note that they use credit checks on that. And so we will probably not include a housing build out in this particular one. We discussed potential lawsuits, we discussed specific concerns, but we've been sued before by Airbnb, whatnot. So lawsuits they could happen, but the lawsuit would be challenging the entire discrimination laws jurisdiction, which we also noticed is completely consistent word for word with the state, employers 6 or more. So we don't go further than the state does, and the state's enabled by its own constitution, or by the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts. So we are at a point where I said I am comfortable looking further into this language. Nadine Cohen will be looking further into the language, the National Consumer Law Center, but I'd like to get something before the body to vote, and I've indicated my support for that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, I've just had a chance to start familiarizing myself with it, but I'm definitely skeptical of this interpretation. Like you say, it has a lot of, it would have a lot of knock-on effects on what the HRC is even able to do. And on the housing front, I just wanted to say that my office, since that last working session, did quite a bunch of research on that and sort of came to a similar conclusion that there's some really good model legislation out there in other municipalities. And it's something that that we should do and that we're hoping to work on in the new year. And glad to hear the administration's amenable to that. But definitely it didn't feel, Madam Chair, knowing kind of the closing legislative calendar here, it didn't feel like something we could get right in the final couple weeks of the year. So definitely we'll put on record my intention to return to the credit checks and sort of as part of a broader set of questions of what people are subjected to when they go to try to rent housing in our city. I think it's a conversation we should be having in the new year. But in the interim, I would just say that I'm happy to write up some written questions for submission to the law department, but I'd be inclined to agree with you that it strikes me as an interpretation that is hard to hold consistent with the fundamental basis of the Human Rights Commission. So.
And also the history of other additional amendments from administrations to include gender identity, to include other protected classes, at which point there was no argument that that inclusion or addition or amendment lied in the face of the Constitution of Massachusetts. So we discussed all of that, but no, there was no one from the law department on today. And so we will happily, unless there's other comments and my colleagues have any concluding remarks or if the administration would like to note anything, I think I have my marching orders. Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Leonard and Ms. Carvalho. My God. This is my.
I'm growing my hair out, so it's okay.
This is my Zoom. I am so sorry. This is Friday is tomorrow. Mr. Carvalho, thank you so much for being here today. I just again want to echo my incredible support and admiration for both of you and your leadership in this space. I want to be very clear. If there was any pushback, it's on the law department's interpretation of what we can do, not at all what you have already proven to have done over and over again. Your own commitment to making sure that regardless of what the law department gets done in our employment practices, you've eliminated that barrier. So I want to thank you, Ms. Leonard, for that. And I want to thank you, Mr. Carvalho. I know we're going to get there and we are better because both of you are in your leadership. So thank you both.
Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you.
And Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today. I genuinely, my compliments for all of you is that conversation that we had in the hearing was overwhelmingly positive and headed towards the vision towards a more equitable city, period. So I want everyone to know that there really is an interpretation debate. That's it, not an intention or heart debate. So thank you. I can go through again, Councillor Braden, Councillor Janey, Councillor Bach, if you have any concluding remarks, and then
I would just say thank you so much to this panel, and many thanks to you, Madam Chair, and certainly to my colleagues for this important discussion, and I look forward to getting it done. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you. This is important work, and I'm really happy that it's moving forward. Well,
and I'll add my thanks and also send my best to Ms. Carvalho. Ashley's a wonderful, wonderful person. So
Thank you.
please do convey my well wishes to her. But thank you. Sorry to appear only at the end here. I had a commitment until 4 o'clock. But looking forward to the work ahead on this, and grateful as ever to the chair.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good day.